That late afternoon, Grace Taylor stood quietly in front of the grand Hawthorne estate. The circular driveway sparkled with expensive cars. A shiny new Bentley, a dark Range Rover, and the red Porsche convertible that her cousin Maya had just shown off on social media. Parked near the back was Grace's old Toyota, the same one she'd driven since college. Its paint was dull, the engine loud, and it looked completely out of place. Several family members glanced at it and whispered. But Grace didn't flinch. She adjusted her simple navy blazer, the same one she'd worn to interviews, meetings, and even funerals. In her hand she carried a leather portfolio. It wasn't flashy, but it held something more powerful than any designer purse. "You've got this," she whispered to herself. Then with steady steps she walked toward the limestone steps of the estate. Grace had learned a long time ago that appearances didn't matter. What mattered was what people didn't see. Where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more. Inside the estate, the air smelled like polished wood and cold perfume. Grace was used to this feeling. The uncomfortable smiles, the raised eyebrows, and the comments hidden behind polite tones. "Still driving that old car?" whispered Dylan, Robert's son, with a crooked smirk. His eyes flicked to her worn flats. "Thought your shoes would be in a museum by now." Grace gave a soft smile. "Still runs just fine," she said calmly. What they didn't know, what none of them even guessed, was that inside her portfolio was the key to over $73 million in real estate. Buildings. Units. Entire apartment complexes, including the one where Maya and Dylan lived without realizing she owned it. Grace had never cared about showing off. Her grandmother taught her that money wasn't for flashing. It was for freedom. And this year, at this family gathering that always felt more like a contest than a reunion, Grace wasn't here to win. She was here to end the game. Years ago, this house had been a warm place for Grace. After losing her parents in a terrible car accident at just 15, it was her grandmother, Helen Taylor, who welcomed her without question. "You're safe here," Grandma Helen had told her, tucking her into the guest room at the top of the stairs. That room overlooked the rose garden, and it became her small world when everything else had fallen apart. The rest of the family didn't really want her around. He heard the whispers. Charity case. Extra expense. But Grandma Helen never let her feel less. She taught her how to look beyond what people say and watch what they do. In the evenings, Grace would find her grandmother in the study, glasses on, flipping through real estate listings, old financial newspapers, and zoning maps. Instead of toys or parties, Helen gave Grace thick books and lessons on reading between the numbers. "Wealth isn't about what you spend," she said one night. "It's about what you can choose to walk away from." The 3 years Grace lived with her grandmother before college were filled with quiet, powerful lessons. She learned that value could be found in empty lots and old buildings, not just in branded labels or glossy addresses. Her cousins got luxury gifts and spa trips. Grace worked after school, saved every dollar, and studied real estate trends. "Be patient," Helen would always say. "Slow beats flashy in the long run." Grace took that advice to heart. When Helen passed away during her last year of college, the rest of the family mourned loudly, lavish flowers, black limousines, and tearful speeches. But Grace kept the real treasures. Helen's journals, her handwritten notes, and the first investment notebook she ever gave her. Those quiet pages became Grace's playbook. They helped her see what no one else in her family did. That money wasn't about attention. It was about power, the quiet kind that didn't need permission. Grace didn't grow up with private jets or ski trips in Switzerland. She was raised in a small house where her dad worked as a local architect and her mom taught kindergarten. They didn't have much, but they had dinner together every night at the same old wooden table. Her father would draw blueprints on the back of napkins, and her mom would help her with homework while baking banana bread. Then one cold November afternoon, everything changed. Grace was at school when she was called to the office. Her aunt was waiting, red-eyed. "There's been an accident," she said. Her parents were gone. Just like that. No warnings, no goodbyes. After the funeral, Grace was brought to live at the Hawthorne estate. To the rest of the family she was just extra weight. Her uncle Robert muttered about tuition costs. Her aunt complained about space. The cousins smiled, but it was the kind that didn't reach their eyes. But Grace stayed silent. She didn't cry. She listened. And slowly she started to learn how the world really worked. At night, when everyone else was asleep, Grace would sit by the small window in her room and write in her journal. She wrote about the things she heard at dinner, the way the family talked about money like a trophy, the deals her uncles bragged about, the way her cousins acted like they were royalty. She wrote down questions, goals, ideas. "I'll build my own table," she wrote one night. "One day I won't need their approval." Her grandmother's old books sat on her nightstand, and each night she studied them like holy texts. Real estate markets, rental strategies, investment psychology. Grace absorbed it all. She didn't speak up, but she noticed everything. The quiet made her sharp. The silence made her strong. She didn't want revenge. She wanted a plan. And she was building one, piece by piece. When Grace graduated from college, there were no fancy job offers waiting for her. No relatives offering to help. No warm congratulations from Robert or Maya. She packed her bags and moved to a small apartment in Midtown Atlanta. It was old and creaky, but it had a tiny office and sunlight in the mornings. She got a job as a freelance financial consultant, helping small businesses manage their books. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She still drove her old Toyota. She still wore the same blazer. Every dollar she saved went into her dream. With the modest inheritance Helen left behind, Grace bought her first property, a rundown duplex in a forgotten part of town. She lived in one side and rented the other. She fixed the plumbing with her own hands, painted the walls herself. Build quiet. Build smart, she reminded herself every night. The duplex sale gave her enough to buy 2 more properties, a small condo near the university and a broken-down storefront with old brick bones and potential. Each deal was backed by careful research, patience, and her grandmother's voice in her head. She never rushed. She never showed off. While her cousins were flying to Bali and posting selfies at rooftop bars, Grace was reading city zoning plans and calculating mortgage margins. She worked with Mr. Henry Franklin, her grandmother's former attorney. He helped her set up a network of holding companies, each one hiding her identity as the owner. "Keep your name off the front page," he advised. "Let the numbers speak instead." Grace took his advice. While her family smiled for magazine features, she installed new security systems in rental units. While they bought sports cars, she bought apartment buildings. Quietly, strategically, one step at a time. By the time Grace turned 28, she owned 12 residential units and 3 small commercial buildings. All of them were profitable. All of them legally protected. And the best part? One of those properties was the luxury apartment building where Maya and Dylan currently lived. They had no idea who their landlord really was. Grace kept it that way. Not because she was afraid, but because she was waiting for the right moment. Every decision she made had a purpose. "Power doesn't come from being loud," she wrote in her journal. "It comes from being unshakable." On the outside, she still looked like the same quiet cousin with the cheap car and plain clothes. But on paper, she had surpassed them all. Her wealth wasn't in handbags or vacation photos. It was in the deed titles, the bank accounts, and the numbers they didn't know existed. And soon they'd find out. That Saturday, Grace returned to the Hawthorne estate for the annual family conference. She had been invited like every year, but this time felt different. Her cousin Rachel had whispered the night before, "They're planning to sell the estate, Grace. Uncle Robert has it all arranged. Contracts, votes, everything." Grace didn't look surprised, but inside her stomach turned. The estate was more than a building to her. It was the last piece of her grandmother's heart. "They've extended the meeting to finalize it on Monday," Rachel added. 3 days. Grace nodded. 3 days to change everything. That morning she stepped into her old room, the same one she'd lived in as a teenager. It was untouched. The bookshelf still held Helen's books. A photo of Grace with her parents at the beach still sat on the nightstand. She stood by the window and looked at the rose garden. The same view she'd had the night her life first changed. And now it would change again. But this time she was ready. On Sunday morning, the estate felt colder than usual. Grace walked into the main conference room, where the long mahogany table was lined with leather-bound portfolios embossed with the Taylor family crest. She found hers near the end of the table, thin, almost empty. She opened it slowly. Inside was a basic summary of her inheritance, a vague mention of her consulting work and nothing more. Of course, Uncle Robert had always made sure she looked like the weakest link. He stood at the front of the room in a tailored navy suit, already speaking. As you all know, voting rights within the family trust are based on declared financial holdings. Today we'll review ownership structures and key contributions. Grace said nothing, just took notes. Her real assets weren't listed here. The properties, the businesses, the holdings, all hidden carefully under anonymous LLCs. She watched her cousins nod and smile as Robert proposed modernizing certain sections of Helen's will. What he really meant was removing the parts that kept him in check. The conversation shifted to key properties owned by the family trust. Robert clicked to the next slide. A picture of the luxury apartment building Maya and Dylan currently lived in. We've had several complaints, he said. Construction noise. Parking changes. Registration rules. No one knows who owns it. If it's an investment firm, I say we approach them with an offer. And if they say no? Dylan asked, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Then we use other means, Robert replied casually. We have friends at the city's planning office. If necessary, we can push a few code inspections their way. Grace's fingers clenched the edge of her notebook. She felt the heat rise in her face. They were openly planning to pressure a legal property owner, her, just because they didn't like change. No one in the room questioned it. No one said it was wrong. That moment, Grace saw her family clearly, not as loved ones but as operators. That afternoon, Grace slipped away to the southern garden, where a stone bench sat beneath the dogwood tree. It had once been her grandmother's favorite reading spot. The cold wind brushed against her face, but she hardly noticed. Her heart still burned from the meeting. It wasn't just the threats about her building. It was the way they spoke about her. To her, like she was a problem they needed to fix. Maybe we should offer Grace a monthly stipend, Robert had suggested in the same syrupy tone he used for reporters. She's always struggled to keep up with the family's lifestyle. Exactly, Dylan had added. She's never really been self-sufficient, right? A few cousins had chuckled, heads nodding in agreement. Grace had stared down at her empty folder and said nothing. But inside something shifted. She wasn't angry. She was clear. Let them laugh. Let them offer crumbs. They didn't know she already owned more than any of them. She sat alone for nearly an hour, staring at the garden's bare branches. In her mind, she replayed her grandmother's voice. Be still before the leap. Don't rush your moment. Grace didn't need to win them over. She needed to outlast them. She pulled out her phone and texted Mr. Franklin. I'm going to use it. Within seconds the reply came, understood. It's all prepared. Grace stood, brushed the leaves from her coat and walked back to the house. The next morning was the final meeting. The vote. They thought they had it locked. What they didn't realize was that the Margaret Legacy Trust now held 35% of voting power in the family company. And she controlled every inch of it. That evening she returned to her old room and spread out the documents across the desk. Tax records. Deeds. Portfolio reports. Legal filings. And one final folder. The deed to the building Maya had just complained about. You're not invisible anymore, she whispered to herself. Tomorrow they'll see. The next morning, Monday at 9 a.m. sharp, Grace entered the conference room wearing a tailored gray suit. Not designer but sharp and perfectly fit. Around her neck hung a single pearl necklace, the one her grandmother had always worn during important meetings. The room was full. Robert stood at the head of the table, beaming with confidence. We're here today to finalize the sale of the estate, he said. All contracts have been prepared. This is the next chapter in our legacy. He motioned for the legal assistants to pass out the documents. But before they could move, Grace rose from her chair. Her voice was steady. Before we proceed, I have something to say. The room paused. A few cousins exchanged confused glances. Robert frowned. Grace, this isn't the time. It is, she interrupted gently. She stepped forward and handed a USB to the AV assistant. Please project this. Moments later, a number appeared on the screen. $73,420,000. Gasps rippled through the room. That's my current net worth, Grace said. For years you've all assumed I was the poor one. An ambitious burden. What you never knew is that I've spent the last decade quietly building a real estate portfolio worth more than most of yours combined. A stunned silence filled the room. Grace pulled out copies of her financial documents and began passing them out one by one. The apartment building Maya and Dylan live in? I own it. Every improvement was made to raise value, not annoy tenants. Maya's face turned pale. Dylan looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Robert tried to keep calm, but his lips tightened. Grace wasn't done. I've also transferred all of my holdings into the Margaret Legacy Trust. That trust now owns 35% of voting shares in Taylor Holdings. And I control it. The room froze. The deal couldn't move forward without her. He had the numbers. And she had the will. Grace returned to her seat, calm and composed. Not triumphant. Not smug. Just grounded. It wasn't about winning. It was about finally being seen. For the first time no one laughed. No one teased her about her car or her clothes. They sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how they had missed the signs. How she had done all this without them noticing. Maya was the first to break. She stood awkwardly and offered a nervous smile. Grace. That presentation was impressive. I mean, really. Maybe you can give me some tips on real estate sometime. Grace nodded politely. Maybe. That was all. No promises. No apologies. Maya hesitated, then turned and walked away. Dylan came next. Grace, I didn't mean those things I said. You know, back when we were kids. I was just messing around. She gave a soft smile. I know. But she didn't say more. Some wounds don't need reopening. They just need distance. The rest of the family stayed quiet. But the shift was clear. Grace was no longer invisible. Not because they finally understood her, but because they could no longer afford to ignore her. Now when she spoke, people listened. When she entered a room, people made space. Uncle Robert even suggested she join the leadership board of Taylor Holdings. Your voice carries weight with investors, he said with a forced smile. Grace saw it for what it was, not respect but recognition. They weren't changing out of kindness. They were adjusting to survive. And that was fine. Grace didn't need their love. She had earned their attention the hard way. Not through flash or noise. Through quiet power. Through years of work. Through her grandmother's teachings. And now she intended to use her voice, not to gloat but to ask the hard questions. Questions no one else had dared to bring to the table. A week later, Grace returned to Atlanta. She stepped out of her car in front of the plain brick building she used to rent a small office in. But now she owned the whole thing. A new sign had just gone up above the glass doors on the 3rd floor. The Helen Foundation. Empower through equity. It wasn't just a name. It was a mission. Inside, a small group of scholarship students waited for her. Young Black, Latinx and first-generation college students who had just received their first grants. Grace walked into the room smiling. My grandmother always told me, she began, that if you're ever lucky enough to have a choice, choose to make someone else's road easier. She didn't talk about the millions. She talked about her first duplex, her first clogged pipe, her fear of property taxes, and the night she almost gave up. But I didn't, she said, because I remembered to be steady. And quiet. And to keep moving even when nobody's watching. Back at the Hawthorne estate, family meetings continued. Debates still happened. Decisions still needed votes. But now, Grace sat at the table, not as the quiet cousin in the corner, but as a powerful voice that could not be dismissed. She didn't demand attention. She asked questions. How are we serving our community? Are we reinvesting wisely? Who are we lifting with our wealth? At first, some of her relatives rolled their eyes. But they didn't interrupt. They listened. Because now they had to. Grace didn't change overnight. And she didn't expect them to either. But she had learned something bigger than profit or property. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you create when no one's clapping. And slowly, with each question, each new idea, Grace began to rewrite what the Taylor family name would mean for generations to come. A few weeks later, Grace found herself invited to a charity gala hosted by the city's development council. It was the kind of event her family had always attended, more for networking than actual charity. This time she was invited not as someone's plus one, but as a keynote speaker. As she stepped onto the stage in a modest black dress, she glanced around the room. There were familiar faces in the crowd. Maya, Dylan, even Robert, all sitting at one of the front tables. They looked at her with a mixture of surprise and quiet respect. Grace didn't speak about generational wealth or flashy success. She spoke about legacy, about her grandmother, and about the power of patient progress. I'm not here because someone handed me a seat, she said. I'm here because I built one plank by plank, through the years no one saw. The audience applauded, not politely but meaningfully. After the event, Robert approached her with a drink in hand. "You spoke well, Grace," he said, offering a nod. "Perhaps we should talk about forming a new strategy arm within the company. Your insights could be useful." Grace met his eyes and smiled. "I'll consider it, but only if the purpose is clearer than the profit." He blinked. Of course. That night she didn't go home to the estate. She returned to her downtown apartment, now beautifully renovated but still simple. She sat on the balcony with a warm mug of tea, looking out at the city she had quietly shaped. Behind the buildings and lights were stories, of renters, of businesses, of families, all connected to her work. She wasn't chasing attention. She was shaping impact. And that meant more than any family title ever could. Back at the Hawthorne estate, the family began making small changes. They started funding community housing projects. They offered internships to first-generation college students. Grace's ideas had started to take root. But more than anything, she had given the family something they hadn't had before: direction. At the next family conference, she was asked to lead a session on strategic investment. The same cousins who once laughed at her shoes now scribbled notes as she spoke. Even Robert listened. Not everything was perfect. Some still resisted. Others still whispered. But Grace no longer cared. She wasn't there to fit in. She was there to lead. And leadership didn't require permission. Only purpose. On the one-year anniversary of the Margaret Legacy Trust, Grace visited her grandmother's grave with a single white rose. The cemetery was quiet, the air still. She knelt beside the stone and laid the flower down gently. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I built something strong. And I didn't lose myself along the way." A soft breeze passed, brushing her face like a quiet blessing. Grace stood, straightened her coat and looked out at the horizon. The world had tried to define her by absence. An orphan, an outsider, the overlooked one. But she had redefined herself by presence. Grace Taylor's name now stood not just on deeds and trusts, but on impact, change and purpose. She walked away from the grave not with grief, but with pride. Because the legacy she carried was no longer hidden. It was alive. And she had become its living proof. Moral lesson. True legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's what you build in silence with integrity until the world can no longer look away. Remember to hit the like button, comment and subscribe to this channel for more of this.